Our next speaker is Jeanette Peterson, who is professor in the Department of the History of Art and Architecture at UC Santa Barbara. Her work has centered on identifying agency of indigenous artists in early colonial Mexico, as in her famous publication, The Paradise Garden Murals of Malinalco, Utopia and Empire in 16th Century Mexico, for which she won the 1995 CAA Charles Rufus Maury Book Award. And I understand that she is currently working on a Spanish edition of this book, surely highly awaited. For many years, she has also worked on the Virgin of Guadalupe, which resulted in her most recent magnum opus, visualizing Guadalupe from Black Madonna to the Queen of the Americas, which is just a massive and beautiful book, heavily illustrated. I highly recommend it. Her talk today, Rhetoric as Acculturation, the Anomalous Book 6 within Sahagún's Encyclopedic project, treats the cultural interchanges between Europe and pre-Columbian traditions as manifested in the Florentine Codex.
Thank you, Kim. What a treat to be at the Getty Center. And how nice that all of you turned out on even this glorious California day. In spite of our drought, I guess we do have to be grateful for our blue skies and sunshine. In the final edition of his general history of the things of New Spain, better known as the Florentine Codex, the Franciscan Bernardino de Sahagún sought to capture the sum of what was then known about the Aztec world in a concrete, pictorialized book form. Although its 12 books approximate the classical and medieval structure of recording knowledge, Sahagún's collaboration with Nahua scribes and artists, his intercultural brokers, necessarily accommodated indigenous epistemologies. The friars' motives for recording the disappearing Nahua tradition in an encyclopedic work were philological and proto-ethnographic. His overriding concern, however, was to facilitate better strategies for eradicating idolatrous practices, inculcating Christianity, and defeating Satan. Today, I focus on the tension and creative interchange between discrete ways of knowing and seeing, as manifest in Book 6 on rhetoric and moral philosophy. Book 6 is unique in many ways. While it is the most authentically Nahua in its language and concepts, paradoxically, it is also a site of contestation, only revealed in a careful comparative analysis of its bilingual texts and images. Neither the manner in which Sahagún packaged his information nor his objectives can be fully understood without a backward glance at his humanist education at the University of Salamanca in Spain. Before taking his vows and venturing to the New World in 1529, it is likely that the young Bernardino studied in the old library of the university beneath a spectacular vault of the night sky. Painted by Fernando Gallego in 1485, thank you. There it is. It was a night sky for a while. Painted by Fernando Gallego in 1485, the galaxy is populated with a zodiac's mixture of fantastic creatures and accurately plotted constellations. These signs can be traced to Islamic and classical models that Gallego creatively combined from Italian and Northern European graphics. Sahagún must have also noted the inframing inscription, and you see it here around the edge of the central scene, a phrase from Psalm 8 that reads, quote, When I look up at the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars set in their place by thee, end quote. The biblical quote reminded the viewer that the firmament, even the passage of time itself, was in the hands of a divine sovereignty. Gallego's reconciliation of several epistemological systems within the scaffolding of Christian tenets provides us with an apt metaphor for the formidable task facing Sahagún in the New World and the complex relationship of text and image in the Florentine Codex. While Gallego's fresco was mapping the heavens, Spain's imperial reach was stretching across the Atlantic. Ptolemaic maps, already in use in Salamanca, would provide a more precise calculation of these frontier spaces. Maps such as this Mappa Mundi in a 1562 volume of Ptolemy were in the library of the College of the Holy Cross at Santiago, Tlatelolco. And Pablo Escalante has reminded us this morning that this was the place where the Florentine was being produced, and also that the library at this college was immensely rich in the books that it had at the disposal of Sahagún and his team. What is interesting is that 372 of these books still remain in the Sutro Library at the State University of California in San Francisco, and I've been spending some time with them. And they are marked with the sello, or the firebrand, of the monasteries you can see on the right. Perhaps you can just make out Santiago's little horse right here, and the sword. There are several firebrands associated with Santiago Tlatelolco. The growing need to encompass the influx of new cultural information, however, would continue to be rooted in a known Euro-Christian framework. Sahagún himself was caught between a medieval mindset that defined knowledge as revealed by the grace of God and the ideas of modernity that credited the human intellect with the capability of producing knowledge. Although Sahagún's student days coincided with the increased literacy that came with printing and the university's curricular expansion, his education followed a traditional program based on the 7 liberal arts, among which rhetoric was considered one of the higher expressions of intellect. The goals of rhetoric were to, quote, teach, to convince, and to rouse, as stipulated in the educational treatise of Juan Luis Vives. Persuasive speech in a well-educated individual was indicative of a person's judgment, moderate behavior, and clarity of thinking. The role of rhetoric was a civilizing force that led people toward the just and the good, end quote, according to Isidore of Seville. St. Augustine, who you see depicted here, drew on it to move the hearts of the audience and to articulate Christian precepts. In New Spain, by 1529, Friar Sahagún was possessed of the necessary intellectual framework to embark on his own encyclopedic project, initiated by his interest in words and rhetoric. The sequence of the Florentine's 12 books aligns with the hierarchical organization of classical and medieval compendia, progressing from at the top the realms of the divine, down through the human to the earthly things. And on the left, you see a list of the 12 books of the Florentine, from the gods all the way down through the human realm, the elite, down to nature, and the earthly things. The schematic ordering of things, which you can see on the right, also appears in the diagrams of the Rhetorica Cristiana of Diego Valadez, a fellow Franciscan, sometimes teaching alongside Sahagún. Only Book 6, on rhetoric and books 12 on the conquest disturb this classification, a point I'll come back to a little later. While many parallels can be made with encyclopedic models, two are most relevant here: the natural history of Pliny the Elder, and I'll make a little advertisement for the Getty Library, because in their special collections at the GRI, in the Getty Research Institute, there are two editions, 16th century editions of Pliny, a 1513 edition published in Venice and a 1582 edition published in Antwerp. So this is a very rich resource for those of you who are thinking about doing scholarship here. So Pliny the Elder was important in the attention he paid to rhetoric, as was Isidore of Sevilla, a 7th century encyclopedist who was very, very popular. And he produced a work called Etymologies, which really looked at the origin of words in order to extract the meaning of things from the names or the words themselves. Both Pliny and Isidore devote considerable attention to rhetoric in their encyclopedic works. Sahagún echoes Pliny, describing his work as a thesaurus, a, quote, treasury and coffer or storehouse. These shared literary tropes reflect the same desire to preserve the memory of things through words. Moreover, Sahagún underscores, as does Pliny, the role of language and rhetoric in particular as the divide between civilized and barbarian, and as a necessity in strong leadership and effective governance. That the art of using words eloquently functioned to inculcate the mores and values of both the Aztec state and New Spain is clearly revealed in Sahagún's Book 6. Sahagún dedicates this book to Fray Rodrigo de Sequeira. He was the Commissioner General of the Franciscan Order and was a prime catalyst in the creation of the Florentine Codex. In the Latin inscription, the book is singled out as the, quote, greatest of them all, as much for its length as for what it expresses. Sahagún also lauds the very elegant, very moral prayers in Book 6, as well as the esteem in which the rhetoricians and orators were held. At the outset of every chapter, Sahagún acknowledges the essential orality of Nahua culture. Quote, here are told the words which truly issued from their hearts when they spoke, end quote. The power of the tongue is embodied in the Aztec ruler, called the Tlatoani, he who speaks. With their consistent inclusion of speech scrolls, the Florentine images focus on spoken communication, free-form, poetic, and repetitive. In contrast, as you see on the left, classically inspired rhetoric was more systematized and dependent on the written word. You can see here that European emblems of rhetoric always transform orality into literacy in the form of an accompanying book or scroll. Book 6 contains a collection of Nahua material known as the Huehuetlatolli, translated as ancient words or orations of the elders. The inherited wisdom handed down by the white-haired ones was so highly valued, it was equated with a precious green stone, a turquoise, perfectly cylindrical, and Kevin, even feathers, as precious as feathers. Yesterday we saw a wonderful speech scroll with a feather attached to it, and I was thinking that may have been a qualifier to indicate just how esteemed and valuable that speech was. Not surprisingly, the Huehuetlatolli comprised Sahagún's earliest material, gathered in 1547, and first penned in the Primeros Memoriales of 1559 to 1601, which we just saw. So this was the first time that Sahagún put his initial edition of his general history together, and it would be much more ample and more beautifully expanded and illustrated in the Florentine Codex many years later. The Huehuetlatoli include prayers to the gods, courtly discourses from ruler to subject, judges' admonitions, congratulatory orations, and advice, both practical and ethical, by such professionals as midwives and merchants. Although there is disagreement on their parameters and nature, anywhere from 61 to 100 of these orations have been attributed to Sahagún alone, dispersed throughout the Florentine Codex and beyond. The sequence of the Huehuetlatoli in Book 6 also follows a hierarchy, as you can see here, from the divine sphere to those of more human concerns. The latter recitations, in turn, are delivered at critical moments in the life of the state, toward the beginning of the Book 6, and these are followed by speeches that mark significant rites of passage for the individual Aztec, such as marriage, going to school for the first time, giving birth, and then, of course, death. I am not quite sure yet. I haven't figured this out, and any suggestions are welcomed, as to why Sahagún actually placed Book 6 where he did. It seems to be pretty crucial. It's right at the nexus, a turning point, really, between the first part and the second half. Both the Conquest and the Rhetoric were the earliest material he acquired, and they were both sort of shoehorned in a way. The Conquest, of course, makes sense because it's at the end, historically and chronologically. Rhetoric, I think, is a way to sort of link divine orations with human concerns. So he may have seen it as a liminal point of sort of transition from the early books to the later books. But again, I'm not 100% sure that theory is right. I'd also like just to mention that there was vertical layering in the Nahua universe as well, and it went from the celestial realm to the terrestrial down to the subterranean. So this wasn't a completely European notion, the idea of strata that went from a divine level down to a more human level. As a code of moral conduct, the Huehuetlatoli rehearse how to live one's life wisely, in moderation, always, that's underscored, and on the straight and narrow. Sahagún appreciated these Nahua orations for their aesthetics, rich vocabulary, and as a key to understanding the pre-contact worldview. The elevated nature of indigenous rhetoric reinforced the intellectual and spiritual potential of Nahua society. Like the discipline of rhetoric in Europe, the teaching of oratory played an essential role in the noble Aztec's upbringing. In the Calmecac, priests instructed boys of the elite class in the craft of oral recitation. Quote, very carefully they were taught good discourse. If one spoke not well, then they drew blood from him. And they are not kidding. The priest has a maguey spine in his hand. Speaking was regulated. To shout, murmur, or to squeak betrayed ill breeding. The pupils were also carefully taught the songs, which they called the God songs. And you can see the florid speech in the lower right-hand image. And this is interesting. In Book 3, it says they were inscribed in the books. Now, this reference points to some kind of pictographic mnemonic record of the songs taught in the Calmecac. Perhaps the Huehuetlactoli were similarly transcribed. This is something else I'm still grappling with. However, Thelma Sullivan concludes in her work that the Huehuetlactoli were intergenerational words of wisdom that were committed to memory in order to perpetuate the traditions of a people whose form of picture writing was inadequate for the task. So I'm still grappling with the idea as to whether or not there was a pre-Hispanic source for the Huehuetlactoli. Now, in yesterday's session, and I hope some of you had a chance to hear those talks, there was a lot of discussion about the importance of words and the centrality of the oral tradition among the Nahuas. One of the things, as I thought about this overnight, is that words and the oral tradition and how words were used really filled a spectrum of possibilities, all the way from this high rhetoric, this oratorical tradition that was ingrained in the education, to the misuse of speech and language, which could pierce, could be hurtful, could solicit, could seduce, we heard yesterday in Lisa's talk. So it could be associated also with very forceful arguments, as Kevin mentioned in his talk. So speech was something you had to be careful of. You had to be careful how you expressed yourself. The shared tradition of rhetorical training converged in the mendicant schools, as seen in an engraving by Diego Valadez. The familiar cadences and vivid metaphors of the Huehuetlactoli provided a ready-made resource for mendicants to incorporate into their sermons and doctrinal discourses. They were also perceived as resonating with the books of wisdom, such as Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Ecclesiasticus. Even Sahagún, who respected the poetic refinement of the original Huehuetlactoli, he said there could not be a living man who would invent such language. But even Sahagún editorialized, guilty of the occasional slippage into Christian phrasing. So he would substitute nuestro Dios, Señor Dios, meaning the Christian God, for a pre-Hispanic God in one of these Huehuetlactoli, at the same time as he would demonize this same indigenous deity as the Diablo. While some of the foremost Nahuatlatos have analyzed the text of Book 6, its pictorial record is understudied and anomalous in some features. For its length of 215 folios, Book 6 has proportionally fewer primary images, only 52, as compared to the ornamentals, of which there are 88, and a surfeit of spaces left blank for missing images. This may be the result of a more robust column of Spanish text, leaving less room for images. But also, given Book 6's uniformly black and white illustrations, I suggest that this may have been one of the sections left to the end of the codices production in 1577, when time, skill, labor, and color pigments had simply run out. Without specific models, the artists may have also struggled to pictorialize the more conceptual texts of Book 6. The Tlacuiloque, here as elsewhere, drew their inspiration from a range of sources and repurposed them in inventive new ways. The unconventional and clearly bipartisan artistic solutions are evident in the first 7 chapters that contain the prayers to Tezcatlipoca, Lord of the Smoking Mirror and the Supreme Deity. Each of the prayers invokes a litany of names for Tezcatlipoca, beginning with our Lord of the Near and the Nigh, Tloque Nahuaque, the great Lord, invisible as the night, impalpable as the wind, end quote. His appellation as the night wind, Yowali Ehekal, emphasizes his invisibility and omniscience. in these 4 puzzling images of Tezcatlipoca that accompany the prayers, the numen is represented by a disembodied head that floats above a desolate landscape. A single devotee below assumes the indigenous posture of humility described in Nahuatl as one that required a bowed head and arms folded, and they're folded across the chest, as you can see. These floating heads have an extended proboscis, a serpent's tongue, and that is sometimes bifurcated, and feather-like extensions, reminiscent of the dragons and griffins that populate medieval books, and this is one I took out of a book in the Tlatelolco library here. It's one of these strange reptilian creatures that seem to creep and crawl over many medieval books. These images clearly depart from the anthropomorphic renderings of Tezcatlipoca and his identifiable emblems. Instead, the composite reptilian heads respond to his title as the wind, Ehecatl, who in the Nahua lexicon had a buccal mask. You can see it in the Primeros Memoriales here, or in this day sign, or sign, calendrical sign for Ehecatl in the Codex Malyabechano. I think what is also interesting is that the sign floats above the devotee a little bit, compositionally reminding me of the calendrical format of day signs hovering over human figures. However, the strange airborne creatures are ambivalent. The additions of feathers, a serpent's tongue, as well as a symbol for preciousness or a star, which you see here, Ishli, on the head of one of them, also evokes Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. As Guillaume Olivier has shown, Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl were often paired, both deities associated with the night wind, sorcery, and creation myths. Thus, these images in Book 6 are fragmented and reassembled, filtered through many degrees of separation from the pre-contact sign system. But for all that, this visual transposition tells us that the artists strategically, if perhaps artificially, are gesturing to the Nahua language and their own heritage. Euro-Christian illustrations, as we have seen recently, were also pilfered as pictorial sources, with a concomitant migration of meaning. Two coupled images, for example, juxtapose depictions of Tezcatlipoca as the night wind with scenes that recall Christian narratives. Below Tezcatlipoca, in this example, a cluster of kneeling figures peer skyward, most with hands clasped in prayer, but 2 in the more indigenous pose with arms folded across their chests. The composition above mirrors any one of the Ascension or Assumption vignettes of Christ, the Virgin Mary, or the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. And I picked one of many possibilities, which you can see on the right. A second juxtaposed image includes a scene of confession and penitence above the Tezcatlipoca image. Nahuas confess their transgressions to Tezcatlipoca as he reputedly could, quote, see into men's hearts, end quote. The penitent verbalized his transgressions to the deity's priest, here on the right, and you can see the force of the speech scrolls that are emerging from their mouths. Catholic and Nahua moral codes were similar, behavior that was considered dissolute and punishable, included in both cases adultery, drunkenness, lying, and sloth, to name just a few transgressions. Concepts of morality and sin, however, diverged dramatically, as Louise Burkhardt has shown. Those who broke Aztec prescriptions were wayward, aimless persons, described as dirty, smelly. Nahuas were admonished for bad behavior, but not because it showed disobedience to God or had consequences for the salvation of one's soul. Instead, their disorderly conduct endangered the community's welfare and undermined the cosmic order. In Book 6, the priest, here, with his clay incensario and burning copal, faces a kneeling penitent who disgorges his sins in a venomous stream of snake, toad, and scorpion. These odious creatures in European iconography were emblematic of such sins as avarice, lust, and demonic forces. And here again, one of many possible choices is a scene of exorcism where Christ is expelling the demonic forces from someone, and these devilish sins and bad things come out of the mouth as reptilian creatures. Similar vermin depict sins in a Valadez engraving, and I'm going to be showing you a detail of the folio on the left. Of the Sacrament of Confession, where, as you can see in the second and third layers, these vermin spew forth from the mouths of natives, while above them serpents writhe in Satan's Medusa-like hair and emerge from his mouth. So here we have the confession, and you can see, goodness, toad, whatever that is, another creepy crawly. This is a scorpion, serpents, and then here is Satan himself with serpents in his hair and in his hands. The confessional image in Book 6 is particularly poignant, as the Florentines' production coincided with the 1576 plague, which we've heard something about this morning, one of the most devastating in Mexico's history. At the outset of the Codex, Sahagún self-identifies as a physician of souls, médico de los ánimas, who makes a diagnosis by studying his patient in order to root out his illnesses, such as idolatry and drunkenness. Later, in assessing the shortcomings of the mendicant program, the Franciscan links the Indians' weaknesses, licentiousness, and evil works so odious to God as to even cause them great sicknesses. Disease, in other words, struck humans in retribution for their sins. With their lack of immunity, the indigenous population was the most vulnerable, and by implication, the most culpable. But is it possible that the Florentine artist in Book 6 is not capitulating wholesale to a Euro-Christian interpretation? During the Aztec ceremony of Atamalcualitzli, priests engaged in the very curious ritual act of eating snakes and frogs. You can see 3 of them here with the darker skin. They have snakes coming out of their mouths, and here's a little pond filled with serpents. The festival honored Tlaloc, the storm and earth lord, and these aquatic creatures were symbols of fertility and renewal. In other words, they were positive, not negative symbols. Now, this is very speculative, but might a Nahua viewer have read the Florentine image of confession not necessarily as abhorrent or a rebuke, but with a more equivocal response? In other words, there may be visual homology here, but dissonance of reception. The ways in which rhetoric could be appropriated for divergent purposes is demonstrated in the textual discrepancy of the Nahua metaphor for good discourse. It is called the light, the torch, the measure, the wide mirror. in Nahuatl on the right. And you can see it replicated in the image. Here's the torch, and here's the mirror. The Spanish text, however, redirects the audience to hearken the wisdom of the preacher's sermon, el sermón que el predicador predica. Book 6 contains some of the most uniquely Nahua ways of expressing and transmitting knowledge found in Sahagún's masterful project. Yet paradoxically, its images and the Spanish interpolations betray the entanglements of a multi-ethnic authorship and the larger colonizing agenda. In the process of acculturation, rhetoric played an essential role in promulgating a different moral and social order, and indeed in creating a world anew. Thank you.
Our last speaker today basically needs no introduction. In my mind, she reigns as the queen of codices, Mexican codices, both pre-Hispanic and colonial. Of course, I'm talking about Elizabeth Boone. Elizabeth is professor of art history and the Martha and Donald Robertson Chair in Latin American Art at Tulane University. Her publications also are too countless to enumerate here, so I will only mention two of her important books: Stories in Red and Black, the Pictorial Histories of the Aztecs and Mixtecs, and Cycles of Time and Meaning in the Mexican Books of Fate, which most of you probably own and intimately know. She has mentored many students in the field, many of whom are now distinguished scholars. Elizabeth has won numerous grants and awards. She was at CASVA not once, but twice, once as a Mellon Fellow and most recently as a Mellon Professor. She also received the Order of the Aztec Eagle from Mexico and is a fellow in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, to name only a few. Her talk today is titled Sahagún, the Ancients and the Indigenous Image, Conceptual Categories for Aztec Culture.
Let me add to the other speakers my thanks to Jeanette and Kevin for organizing such a splendid conference. I've learned so much, and it's really been an extraordinary experience, a great weekend. In this talk, I want to explore two aspects of Sahagún's ethnographic project: the Old World sources, many of them ancient and some modern, that helped him conceptualize the cultural categories that would guide his investigation, and the indigenous images that were the foundation for the data that brought life to his ethnography. Here I'm walking well-trod ground, but I am hoping to add a few insights of my own. To do this, I want to put into dialogue Sahagún's treatment of the Aztec gods and the Aztec kings. We will see that the Aztec kings easily migrated from their pre-conquest frame to the pages of the Codex Florentine. But the Aztec gods had to be constructed from an array of discursive practices. Clearly, Sahagún and other early ethnographers were deeply influenced by the writing of the ancients, classical and medieval authors, who likewise gathered and organized broad-ranging data on the spiritual and secular world. Father Garibay, Arthur Anderson, and Donald Robertson have proposed models such as Pliny the Elder, Isidore of Seville, and Bartholomeus Anglicus, a fellow Franciscan, for the whole. And of course, many speakers yesterday and today have mentioned these fundamental sources. Robertson points out, and Jeanette has mentioned this also, that the Codex Florentine proceeds like Bartholomeus' Encyclopedia, from the divine to the heavens to humankind, and finally to mundane earthly things. For more specific topics, we have Theophrastus' study of moral characters for Sahagún's The People, Flavius Josephus' History of the Jews for customs, and Pliny's Natural History for earthly things, as Pablo Escalante and others have shown so well. And today it was so exciting to add to this, to learn more about Van Cube, Olaf Magnus, and Alciate. We can also add to this list the newer studies of foreign peoples that began to be written in the 13th century and published in the 16th. Ellen Baird has mentioned the ethnographies of the Mongols by the Franciscans John de Plano Carpini and William Rubrek. I would like to add the broadly popular collection of customs gathered and arranged by Johannes Boemus, another Franciscan, published in 1520. So Sahagún's encyclopedic project was clearly an extraordinary undertaking, but it relied also on the efforts of others to chart a path. For his treatment of the Aztec kings, Sahagún does not seem to have followed a European model, and I'll talk more about this later. But his treatment of the gods looks to classical, medieval, and early modern encyclopedias that list and describe the gods of foreign religions. The Primeros Memoriales presents only the images of the gods, 36 in all on 36 in number on 12 pages, and an itemization of their physical attributes. The Florentine Codex pictures most of the same gods, 4 to a page, each separated by a frame. In the Florentine, glosses name them and sometimes link them to Roman counterparts, but they are described in the texts that follow, and these descriptions adhere to a consistent format. They first note the gods' principal and variant names and relate them to other associated deities. They next explain their realms and influence and describe their rituals. And finally, they itemize the deities' physical attributes, clothing, and accoutrements. The Florentine Codex divides the deities into major and lesser supernaturals. Guillaume Olivier has proposed, and that makes absolute sense, that Sahagún followed St. Augustine in organizing the Aztec deities into major gods, major goddesses, and lesser gods. I propose that for the overall presentation of the gods, Sahagún drew also on studies of pagan gods that began in the 13th century and flourished especially in the mid-16th. This genre can be traced back to the early 13th century treatise, The Images of the Gods, by an author known simply as Albricus Philosopher. Albricus gathered information from a variety of early authors, but his contribution was to organize it as an encyclopedia. He devoted a chapter to each of almost 20 gods, describing for each the god's appearance and physical attributes, its realms of influence, the meanings associated with it, and its relation to other gods, just the kind of information that Sahagún includes in the Florentine. So, for example, Albricus's first chapter on Saturn begins thusly, and I quote, Saturn, number 1. The first god was Saturn. They say that he was old, sad, white-haired, his head covered in a blue cloak, that he devoured his own sons. He carried a sickle, and in his right hand a fire-vomiting snake that devours his own tail. Number 2. History maintains that Saturn's father and Jove, his son, had obtained a kingdom in Crete, unquote. Albricus then continues in this vein with details about Saturn's offspring, actions, and astronomical associations. Albricus's treatise, with its emphasis on visual appearance, would exert a profound and lasting influence on studies of the iconography of the gods. It influenced Petrarch's description of the Olympian gods, which likewise described their poses, costuming, and attributes. Albricus also influenced Giovanni Boccaccio, who wrote the best known and most influential of the 14th century encyclopedias of ancient gods, this called the Genealogy of the Pagan Gods. Boccaccio remained the principal source for the imagery and mythology of the classical gods until the mid-16th century, when it was replaced by a cluster of new manuals published between 1532 and 1556. The best known of these is Vincenzo Cartari's The Images of the Gods of the Ancients of 1556. Such studies, or the idea of such studies, probably helped Sahagún frame the questions he would ask of his informants and the information he would ultimately include. Though these models help Sahagún and other friars construct or reconstruct what we now call ethnographic knowledge about Native peoples, the raw data of this knowledge was grounded in the figures and paintings of Mexican pictography. In the rest of this talk, I want to focus on the contribution of the indigenous image. No other culture colonized by Europeans in the early modern period was documented in paintings to the extent that the Aztecs of Mexico were. The cultural encyclopedias of Mexico are a distinct genre, one uniquely grounded in images, images derived largely from the indigenous tradition of Mexican pictography. In them, the indigenous image became reconceptualized in order to serve a Spanish purpose. In an off-cited comment that Eloise quoted at length yesterday, Sahagún reports that the elders of Tepeapulco gave him, and I quote, all the manners we discussed in pictures, and the grammarians explained them in their language, writing the explanation at the bottom of the painting. I still have these originals, unquote. These original paintings are lost, of course, but I think we can reconstruct something of their nature by looking closely at the surviving images in the Primeros Memoriales, Codex Florentine, and other early cultural encyclopedias. Let's start with the lords. The images of the lords were readily available in common sources and translated easily to the cultural encyclopedias, carrying with them many of the features of their original sources. Stylistically, they stand out for their orthodoxy in adhering to the canons of Mexican pictography. In the Primeros Memoriales before you, the lords are stacked top to bottom on the right side of the pages. Each image adheres stylistically to its pre-conquest source, for it is a pictogram, a symbolic statement rather than a likeness of the ruler. The forms are flat and ideoplastic, being composed of forms that are canonically known rather than observed with the eye. They are simply constructed of a profile head, selected body parts, and that the lower back, the rump, the toes, and the lower feet, and attributes. These are the cloak, the headdress, the nose bar, the absence of the nose bar, and the seat and the name sign. The pictographer distinguishes the first three rulers, Acamapixtli through Chimalpopoca on the left, from the others by means of the circular fan device of yellow parrot feathers on their head, the leather cloak, and the simple seats of reeds that signal their pre-imperial Chichimec-derived status. But beginning with Izcoatl, the imperial rulers wear the pointed turquoise diadem, or the Xihuitzoli, the turquoise nose bar, and the royal turquoise blue cape with star border, and sit on the high-backed woven reed throne. These images retain much of the flavor of pre-conquest originals. Glosses name each attribute in a monotonous litany of symbolic elements. There is the name sign painted in red, or written in red, and written in black from the top to the bottom. There is the headdress, the nose bar, the cape, the star border of the cape, and the seat. These same attributes are listed for each ruler through Cuauhtémoc, the last of the Aztec rulers, the indigenous, the pre-conquest Aztec rulers, but not thereafter. The colonial governors are identified by name only. The accompanying text on the left side of the page is equally repetitive, recording the names of the rulers, the number of years they ruled, and sometimes one or two major conquests and events, such as the conquest of the Tepaneca, the Great Famine of One Rabbit, and the dedication of the Templo Mayor. It is clear that this section of the Primeros Memoriales, in its union of ruler, reign length, and event, is derived from fairly standard pre-conquest annals histories. And although these annals histories have only survived in early colonial copies, the copies retain most of the fundamental features of their prototype. The Codex Mexicanus, for example, records the identity of the rulers and the memorable events of each reign, such as natural and climatic phenomena, conquests, and other events of general import to the polity. Here also we see that Ahuitzotl is crowned, seated, enthroned, and named, much like he is in the Primeros Memoriales. Something like the ruler list in the first part of the Codex Mendoza may also have been a prototype, for here history is segmented according to the rulers and their conquest, recorded together on a page. The Mendoza rulers canonically wear the Xihuitzoli, have a speech scroll that signifies the title of Tlatoani or speaker, are seated on a woven mat, and are glyphically named. A related presentation of rulers, but without the conquest, is found in the back of the Codex Auban, where on each page the ruler is identified, with name sign, crown, blue cloak, speech scroll, and high back throne. The specific years are not given, as they are in the Primeros Memoriales, but the quantities of years are. Tizoc on the left ruled 4 years, after which Huitzot ruled either for 18 or they crossed it out and made it 17. The rulers section in the Primeros Memoriales distills the major features of these annals. Like them, it emphasizes the unbroken sequence of rulership, a canonical presentation of the ruler's form and costume, and the links of their reigns. But because its subject is the rulers themselves and not Aztec history per se, only some of the historical material is retained, not to be pictured, but only included in the explanatory text. For example, for Huitzot, the text says, "And when Tezoctlicatzin died, Tezoctlicatzin died, Huitzotzin was installed as ruler. He ruled 18 years. He completed the temple in Tenochtitlan. He ignited the fire to dedicate the building, and for this fire drilling, the Teocoaca were conquered. And he confined the waters of the Aquequesco, with which the Mexica were inundated." Water, unquote. The Codex Florentine continues this traditional form of representation, with both the pre-conquest rulers and the colonial rulers, seated on the traditional high-back throne, wearing the Xihuitzoli and named glyphically. The painter has ignored the distinction in clothing of the first 3 pre-imperial rulers, and instead has standardized all the pre-conquest kings with the signifiers of imperial rule: the diadem, the cloak, the high-back throne. Even the post-conquest rulers are marked with Xihuitzoli and throne. His message is a simpler one than that in the Primeros Memoriales. His message is that all the pre-conquest rulers were equal in their status, and the colonial ones continued in their tradition. He does, however, reserve the royal blue cloak for the royal kings by dressing the non-royal colonial governors in simpler capes. It is abundantly clear that the pre-conquest canon was to signify rulers seated, enthroned, appropriately accoutred, and glyphically named. One almost never sees rulers posed in other positions in the traditional annals. This preference for the seated ruler extends even to the paintings in Diego Duran's Historia, which are laden with European Mannerist embellishments and pictorial illusionism, and are so visually descriptive and representational. Occasionally, Duran's artists present the Aztec kings standing or fighting within the 3-dimensional space of a narrative scene. But more often, the kings hew to the convention of the seated ruler, with turquoise cape and diadem, seated on his high-back throne. This holds true, and you see this on the right, even when the indigenous throne is transformed into a Mannerist construction of scrollwork and arabesques. And here the painter has also retained the old convention of the death of one ruler, who is Huitzot, followed by the seating of the next, Tizoc. One of Duran's painters even extended this convention to Hernán Cortés as future ruler. When the figure of Cortés is first pictured in Duran's Historia, after Cortés's landing in Veracruz, Duran's painter rendered the conqueror seated, enthroned on the X-shaped folding hip chair of European imperial authority, and clothed in a luxurious black and gold cloak with large feathered hat, both symbols of status and power. So you can see how excited I was with Kevin's talk, with all of those rulers seated on thrones, and then Cortés and the Spaniards with all those feathers. When Sahagún's painters developed their pictorial lists of the Aztec rulers then, they extracted the ruler images from the annals histories and transferred them to the encyclopedias. The images maintained the old pre-conquest poses and costumes and brought with them as attributes some of the information associated with them in the originals, such as the reign links and events, which found a home in the alphabetic text. Let's switch to the gods. The Aztec gods were vastly more difficult to capture, however. At the time of the conquest, no book existed of the Aztec gods. So it was not simply a matter of copying something that had already existed as a genre. The gods had been visually known to the Aztecs in the form of cult images housed inside temples that were inaccessible to many, and by means of deity impersonators who publicly enacted their rituals. These deity impersonators, who were humans dressed in the physical accoutrements of the gods, were ephemeral representatives who ceased to perform at the time of the conquest. The cult images were actively sought out and destroyed, and although some carved in durable stone have since been excavated, these were not Sahagún's visual sources. Alfredo López Austin suggested that the elders drew the gods from memory, and H.B. Nicholson proposed that specifically they remembered the deity impersonators who performed during the Ventana festivals. And some of these are illustrated in the very early festival section of the Codex Borbonicus. But I would like to point out that Sahagún began his project 38 years after the conquest. So 38 years after the last deity impersonator performed. And I know I have individuals, I know some of you disagree, but I think it would be remarkable if his informants could have remembered all the details of costumed impersonators who last performed almost 2 generations earlier. Rather, I agree with Eloise and Diana that these knowledgeable elders must have pulled images from the pre-conquest codices. The Primeros Memoriales presents the gods much like it does the Aztec lords, as ideoplastic two-dimensional entities in the pre-conquest tradition. Glosses name them and name the items of their attire, but do not otherwise describe them. Beyond this, however, the similarities with the Lord's end. Almost all the Primeros Memoriales gods are upright, with their legs positioned one in front of the other, knees somewhat bent, and feet seeming to dangle. It is not quite a standing pose, but close to it. One finds distant models for these deity images in the Aztec and Borgia group divinatory manuscripts, where the gods appear as patrons of the day signs, the Tricenas, and other units of time. And Diana Magaloni showed some of these from the Borgia yesterday. The Aztec manuscripts almost invariably pose these supernaturals with arms outstretched in front at an angle and their legs positioned in a pinwheel, one leg up and one leg back. This is the standard pose of the male Tricena patrons and the male lords of the day and the lords of the night in the Aztec tonalamacs. The females have their knees together beneath their skirts. Both have their arms outstretched in a distinctive pose that may signify their control over the temporal units. When the friars asked for images of the gods, the indigenous elders probably turned to the divinatory books as the only relevant graphic source at hand. In extracting the images and repurposing them for the cultural encyclopedias, though, they enacted 2 fundamental changes. First, they reconceptualized the images ontologically, and then they transformed them visually. By reproducing them individually, they tore them from their divinatory and sacred contexts and discarded all their meaningful association and roles there. Unlike the Aztec rulers, which transferred to the encyclopedias with their associated historical data, the deity images lost their divinatory associations. The transfer also reduced the formally signifying signs, which then became simple visual representations of anthropomorphic beings. What had been a complex visual statement within a rich network of meaning became an illustration for a European viewership. Colonial ethnographies of the mid-16th century show an intermediate step between the pre-conquest images and those in Sahagún's manuscripts. The Codices Malebeciano and Tudela on the left, and the Codex Tulariano on the right, consistently employ images of individual supernaturals to signify the Ventana celebrations, where they function somewhat like logos, to use H.B. Nicholson's term. These figural renderings were isolated on the page of European paper, framed by pristine space that invited inspection and the addition of textual exegesis. Descriptive annotations then came to be written opposite or below. But as the first mark put on each page, the figure commanded an extravagant amount of paper, where it waited for discussions and words to complete it and articulate its meaning. The image is the foundation for the unit of information and the source from which the discursive text springs, although neither the text nor the image can inform adequately without the other. This process of reconceptualizing the deity images also transformed their formal properties. In the Codex Malebeciano especially, which is on your lower left, the painter has made the figures full and fleshy, with curved lines to suggest a new three-dimensionality and a more organically coherent human form. Since the distinctive pose of the augural patron no longer carries its pre-conquest divinatory meaning, the artist allowed the pose to degenerate. Arms are still usually outstretched and holding attributes, but often one arm is simply omitted. The leg position, while retaining the basic pinwheel, has become less distinct, so the figures appear in an awkward half-seated, half-standing, or crouching pose. The Malebeciano painter, recognizing this awkwardness, even added a low stool to give his posed deity something to sit on. The image here has changed conceptually from an element in pictography to a mimetic replication of a deity. The painters of the Primeros Memoriales kept the indigenous ideoplastic form, but like the Malebeciano and Tudela painters, they discarded the original context in order to create visual representations that were intended to educate European eyes. The old pinwheel pose, having lost its meaning, is further reduced to two bent legs, one in front of the other, with dangling feet. Only some costume elements are retained to become the basis for the alphabetic annotations. And I want to point out that Tlaloc has lost his very diagnostic nose and mouthpiece. And Diana Magaloni mentioned that occasionally, that fundamental elements are missing from these deity representation as possibly as a way of sort of robbing that image of its fundamental sacrality and power. The transformation of the Aztec image into a European one is carried further in the Codex Florentine, where the figures are as corporeal as those in the Malebeciano. Their proportions more closely approximate those of the human body. Most are rendered with their upper torsos turned to a three-quarter view, and many stand firmly on an implied ground. Conceptually also, the images have been gathered into a set, and sets, by their nature, establish parity between members of the assemblage and relate them to each other as entities that belong to the same class of things. Sahagún provides what he considers a canonical set of Aztec deities. This idea of gathering together all the gods in a set probably came from the model of European collections of pagan gods, Albricus and others. Sahagún's text in the Florentine is telling, for like Albricus's text, it focuses on the gods' names and titles, their powers, their ceremonies, and their attire. Ultimately, only the attire derives from the ancient indigenous image, and then much reduced iconographically and transformed pictorially. Thus, if we think back to Sahagún's original request at Tepepulco for information on Aztec rulers and Aztec gods, we can imagine the kinds of paintings the indigenous sages brought forth. For the rulers, they provided annals histories, perhaps even special purpose ones like that in the Codex Mendoza, which concentrates on the sequence of rulers, the reign links, and conquest. Such images easily made the transformation to the European conceptual category of rulers. For the gods, the sages probably brought forth divinatory codices, or images already extracted from these. But because of the conceptual divide between supernatural patrons in the context of an almanac, which had by now been rendered idolatrous, and the descriptive listing of Aztec gods that Sahagún ultimately desired, the original pre-conquest images had to be fundamentally transformed. The indigenous image had to be stripped of its external associations, reconceptualized as a painted replica of an otherwise physical entity, and then subsumed within an encyclopedic effort modeled after European goals. Thank you.
Thank you for everybody for the great presentations. This question is for Dr. Boone. You know how in Tlaloc, for a good example, is there, wouldn't it been a better picture to draw would be to give him the goggle eyes to identify him? Because when you really, when I was researching Tlaloc, I was looking at the Primeros Memoriales as well. He loses a lot of his very classic look. So if you're a priest trying to figure out or trying to find attributes of Tlaloc, wouldn't it be better to find his goggle eyes or his fangs and the like?
I absolutely agree. Is that on? I agree with your point. What's interesting is that in manuscripts like the Malibaciano and Tudela and Telleriano Ramensis, which I believe, well, certainly the first two I believe are copies meant to be sent to Europe, but in the originals from which those were derived, the prototypes, were probably missionary documents. And those do retain Tlaloc's mouth forms. But Sahagún is very interesting because they're lost in the Primeros Memoriales and in the Florentine. And that, in some ways, suggests that I don't really know why. But it may be, I don't know whether in the Primeros Memoriales, the early one, they're trying to undemonize Tlaloc in some ways, to make him more anthropomorphic or more human-like. So to line up better with the pagan gods. But it is a very interesting sort of phenomena. And you're right. I mean, the missionaries would want to see those, see that mouth mask.
Yeah, because when I see those, you lose a great deal. I feel like you almost lose the outward appearance of Tlaloc with that. If somebody who's alien to a culture coming into it, I wouldn't be able to see Tlaloc as much easier.
Well, he has those little, he's got the cheek things, he's got the black skin, he's holding the right baton. So those subtle things are still there. But you're right, it's very interesting.
Thank you.
So are you suggesting self-censorship on the part of the artist?
Well, I wasn't until yesterday. until I heard Diana Magalones. And then, you mentioned, I can't remember which deity you were talking about. You mentioned, what? Pinal. And you mentioned the blue, the lack of blue, that's right, in the cape and the shield, as a way of kind of robbing him of some of that force. And so I thought, oh, well, I'll throw this out for Tlaloc, because I've always been wondered why he lost that very identifiable mouth and nose piece. Yeah. So no, I don't know, to tell you the truth.
I mean, this brings up an interesting point that I think we could all sort of think about is who was the Florentine Codex made for? What eyes? What was the viewership? And we speak primarily about the European eye, but in my view, the minute you put hand to paper, whether you're a scribe or an artist, by implication, you are creating an audience for that document. There's a part of you that enters into the product that was intended for a mixed viewership. So, I mean, it may be a question of degree, but I don't think we can exclude the fact that the indigenous participation in the product built in a kind of indigenous audience or viewership.
I would agree with that, and certainly you see it in the representation of the rulers, because they do appear not universally seated, but often in that classic canonical seated pose. And so that's clearly something that comes out of the indigenous tradition, and it has meaning in that tradition. So, so you're right when I said intended, but I do think these deity images, the way they are fundamentally transformed, are transformed from a pictographic statement that is like a text to a mimetic, if I can, replication of something that is actually seen. And so I think that transformation is real. It's a different conception of what those deities are.
I mean, what may also be happening in the process, because I think you're absolutely right about that transformative process, they become more like idols. In other words, in fleshing them out, they become more like the golden calf, more three-dimensional, more sculptural, more pagan in a way. So again, you have this quality of, is there an element of editorializing on the part of the artists themselves, even as they copy indigenous sources?
And I love that you mentioned the question of audience, because that's something that I've been thinking about a lot when I was reading your papers. But then also, it's been sort of this discussion we've had throughout the few days, and also in our conversations with you and Kevin. Who's making these choices, and to what degree is Sahagún dictating, sort of micromanaging things, and to what degree is it the indigenous artists? And it seems like a lot of it is indigenous artists making these choices. Yeah.
Pablo makes that point.
Well, about this last question, was Sahagún behind them dictating? It seems that the whole team is so integrated. They're thinking about the work, and I can hardly see Sahagún going after them, because they seem to be far beyond that point. They had been having dialogue for many years. They understood each other. They were looking quite for the same thing. So there was not this difference between the master and the followers. They were pretty much colleagues in a project, as they were in other kind of results or outcomes of their collaboration, as the Salmodia Cristiana, which is so linked to the Florentine. But what I wanted to mention was the apparent contradiction or the paradox that these images of Borbonico, Magliavecchi, and Tudela are quite early, and they seem to be linked to the first stage of the research on native religion, which is more associated with Olmos, with Fray Andrés de Olmos, and this first moment when Franciscans received the instruction to start gathering information on native religion. So in this first stage, it seems that Spaniards and friars specifically, and Andrés de Olmos particularly, has this ruling role. He's asking them to bring the papers, to bring the codices, and explain things so that he can write it down. So the natives in this first stage are more passive, you say? Passive, waiting for the orders of this new research carried by Andrés de Olmos. And then we have figures of the gods like Tlaloc that look more like pre-Columbian ones, that they have their features, their pictographic features more complete. And then, some decades later, when it is the natives themselves who are carrying out the process that are much more involved, it is when the pre-Columbian gods images start losing their pre-Columbian features. So when the friars are more involved, we get more pre-Columbian-like figures. When the natives are leading the process, it is more, and perhaps it also has to do with the fact that it is more advanced, all the process of this new syncretic culture that has neutralized many of the pre-Columbian images. But it's interesting because one would think the opposite. One would think if the Indians are so involved, they will bring their deities exactly that they were, but it is not like that.
The only, it's already, all right. The only, I mean, I agree. I mean, certainly Olmos was a precursor, and these Malebeki and Tudela things probably come out of that project. And, you know, Olmos founded the convent at the monastery at Tepeapulco, where Sahagún was, you know, 30 years later. So there is that kind of linkage there. But the only thing that keeps me from wanting to push the absolute chronology too much is the image of Tlaloc in the Codex Issachar. And I tried, I couldn't really squeeze it in, and the talk was rambling enough. But here you have, he's presented as a human, I mean, absolutely beautiful Renaissance pose, beautifully drawn toes, toenails, all of that, three-dimensional. But the torso from here and to the face is absolutely flat. It's like, it's a ideoplastic image. So you have this really interesting juxtaposition of this flat pre-Columbian where you have all the display of the iconographic sort of program. And then you have it sort of stuck on top of a three-dimensional form. And this is late. I mean, that's Pomar's Relación, so that's from the 80s probably, right? 1580s. So,
but
yeah,
there's the circumstance that in the Ixtlilxochitl Codice, they are also working and copying and using a third copy of this Magliabecchi and Tudela material, or they're working with the same original? I mean, they have that very close.
Yeah, oh, I'm sorry. I was talking about the second part of the Ixtlilxochitl that has the Pomar material, not the first part that's the Malebecchiano group material. What? Oh, yeah, we probably should talk.
Thank you. Those were such wonderful papers. And I wanted to ask you, again, both a question. Thinking about the very interesting arguments you're making about different images and words leading to the making of other images and words, about what you make about something that we haven't really addressed, which is that in the Florentine Codex, you both were talking about how the order in which we imagine these things is that the pictorial image leads to an oral spoken word and then to a transcription of that. But for the Florentine Codex, we have the Nahua text written first and then the images done later. And so that the order is not, it's inverted, and how that might produce different meanings, or how might that make this document different in the work that the image and the word are doing in relation to each other.
Sure, I think it's a wonderful question, Daniela, and I think it's a very important aspect of the Florentine that we always need to take into consideration. And that's the sequence in which the various texts and the images were placed on the codex. So you're going from an oral culture that uses pictographic manuscripts that are partially mnemonic because they don't, not every word is, to an artist who's, and I would assume the scribes as well, are relying on these pictorial manuscripts for, again, their images and possibly also their text. And I think the artists, by the time, and the other consideration of chronology and process that I want to remind all of us of is we don't have any clear dates as to exactly when the Florentine was completed. And I've seen all kinds of dates play. But let's assume in 1575, when Sequeira gave the green light, it was begun. And then we have 1576, which Diana has very eloquently described as being catastrophic for the Florentine with the epidemic. Artists were dying, scribes were dying, pigments were unavailable, and so forth. And so you may have had, we don't know, many of the artists die in the first wave of the epidemic, and so a new group may have been brought in, or at least partially brought in. And I think, personally, that Book 6 was one of the later ones that was illustrated along with the rest of 11 and almost all of 12. So we need to keep that time frame in mind as well to try and understand the relationship of text and image. So we have like a 20-year period where the first texts were collected and then transcribed and then the images were put in place. And Diana's dying to ask a question.
Just one little thing. I really love both your papers. Thank you so much. I would have a lot of questions, but I just wanted to make a comment of what you just said. We know that it was started in 1575, not right in the beginning of the year, because the money came somewhere around 75, so that is not a whole year. Then we know for sure they are writing in 76 because Sahagún himself says, I'm here in Tlatelolco, it is November 8th of 1576, and I'm seeing all these people dying. No? It's written in book 11. And then we know that Sequeira took the document, the manuscript, to Spain in 79. So it has to be, we know, the other thing we know is that it wasn't finished, that the paintings in book 12 were not finished. When I studied the original manuscript for 6 months, just every day from 9 to whenever they closed, I really think that book 6, it's purposefully painted black and white. It's not the last one, and that it doesn't have pigments on purpose, and I've written about it in 2 occasions, but I am sure that book 12 was the last, it wasn't finished, and it has some painted images, and those images are really symbolic and important. So that is just things that I think that are more or less, like we are stepping into more or less hard ground, I think.
Question. The turquoise nose piece, was that just for royalty, or?
The sun god also wore it. And the nose bar, yes. Well, now, there's the nose bar. And then there is like a little flag that in the Borgia group manuscripts the rulers wear and Tezcatlipoca wears, so it's a symbol of rulership. But the turquoise nose bar, as far as I know, is reserved for royalty. And the sun god and I think the fire god, Xiuhtecutli, and maybe someone else. Guillaume, you would know. I don't think Tezcatlipoca has a turquoise nose bar, does he? No. Yeah. Oh, warriors do.
At the museum there is a warrior with a turquoise nose piece.
I'd have to check them into.
In his arm.
Could very well be, but so many of the. But so many of the warriors were in fact nobles. The sons, the cousins, the brothers of the lords. So we could all be right. I hope so.
With regards to the sequencing or the order of the books and mentioning book 6 and the section that it's in, you put up the image showing the 7 liberal arts, and rhetoric was the only one facing away. Why is that, and can that potentially lead us to the answer of why book 6 is where it's at, positionally, as far as the sequencing of the books?
I'm going to start by saying I don't know. Rhetoric was one, in the 7 liberal arts that were taught, there was the trivium and the quadrivium, and rhetoric was the 3rd. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric in the trivium, and then the mathematical arts, math, geometry, astronomy, what am I missing? Music, thank you. So I don't know that in every image I've ever seen it's in the middle, but I will look again at that graphic. Thank you for pointing that out. I don't think I'd noticed that. Does anyone else have any good ideas as to why it's in the middle of the...
Oh, you mean the Florentine?
Yeah.
It does fit with the interest in, well, I would say oration, well, the interest in divination. It's an intellectual art. Mm-hmm. So it's still in the, it's not quite as divine as some of the others, but it's part of sort of a, a kind of invisible world that belongs to to ideology, I would say. And so when you leave that, you go to astronomy, right? You go to stars and things, and that's just stuff. And then you go to the secular world, right. And the stars are beginning to be. So I think it actually fits really well as in that spot. Mm-hmm. So it's still looking toward the divine. And not fully embraced by the secular. Mm-hmm. Just a thought.
Good.
Actually, both books, the one on astrology and the one on rhetorics, would be the right, how to say, bisagra, or the limit
the pivot.
Both are partially
the liminal space.
Divine, partially civil. So that would be but both of them share this ambiguity, and that would be their place, I think.
I had a question for Jeanette. I was really interested to know that there were so few images in the book on rhetoric. But then I started thinking about it, and rhetoric is all about words, and not so much about images. And I'm wondering whether that wasn't a conscious choice to represent speeches just in words.
I think that's a very good point. I also think that Sahagún was so excited by these Huehuetlatoli that he wanted to record every word in Spanish. So there wasn't the room left for images that there were in other areas where he was a little more bored, or he didn't think it was quite as crucial for his evangelistic program. So he, I think it was in part because he was so thrilled with the quality of these orations.
I just wanted to raise the quick point that the book's actually called Rhetoric and Moral Philosophy. And so I think in part that explains how it moves between the sacred and earthly matters.
This is a slightly different approach, but how did the library of Santiago Tlatelolco get to San Francisco?
So there was a man named Adolphe Sutro who invented something to do with silver mining, like some technology, some breakthrough in the 19th century, and became a multi-billionaire. Bought up half of the real estate in San Francisco, ultimately was the mayor of San Francisco. There are all kinds of Sutro monuments in San Francisco. And he was a bibliophile, and in 1886, 89, had his book buyer in Mexico who went to the Abadiano bookstore, a well-known bookstore, and literally bought everything in the bookstore. And among the thousands of volumes was the Santiago Tlatelolco library. So it went back to San Francisco in the late 19th century. Half of those volumes disappeared in the Great Fire and Earthquake of 1906. Fortunately, the Mexican books were in a warehouse that was untouched. So it remained in San Francisco. I think it was given to the state initially, if I remembering correctly, in the 1920s, and then to San Francisco State University. And they've just completed a new library. If you have a chance to go, it's modern, it's lovely to work in, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, so that's why it's there. And let me just add that, much to my disappointment, most of the illustrated volumes are not in that collection. And my sense is they were sold off earlier, probably to Garcia y Casbalceta, who purchased many, many books. And he even, I hate to say this, cut off the firebrands of the monasteries so they couldn't track the origins of the books.
And those are now at Texas, right? The University of Texas? The Garcia y Casbalceta collection is. The Benson Latin American collection.
So that's where I have to go.
That's where you have to go, Austin.
I just wanted to add something about how important rhetoric was for both Franciscans and Indians as well. It is interesting to remember how Sahagún, in his writing, emphasizes how these discourses, these rhetoric pieces, demonstrate the high level of this native culture education. It was like the proof or their plenity in civilization for the Franciscan point of view. And for the Indians, it was their way into the world of the books and the literary culture that the Franciscans offered them. Because they were studying the Trivium, but the book, the one that they had by their bed, was a book of rhetorics, which was the Ad Erenium that has been attributed to Cicero. And that was, they owned a copy. That was their truly libro de cabecera, a copy of the Ad Erenium by their Petate at the Colegio de Santa Cruz. So it was the book to go into the culture, the literary examples and the books that they were offered. For both of them, it was like the gate for the Franciscans to show that native civilization was completely compatible and similar to Western civilization. And for natives, it was their way into the whole world of the Colegio de Santa Cruz.
In addition to Cicero, they also had copies of Quintilian, the Roman order. So it was very important in their educational system.
This question is for both speakers. This is probably not a very scholarly question, but I know you're very passionate about this subject, and so I was wondering, for both of you, if you could describe what the Florentine Codex means to you personally in a few words or in a sentence, how would you do that?
Probably like that book of rhetoric, that's probably
You mean as a personal?
Personally?
Well, I could be really sort of practical and say that when I was invited to come to this conference, I thought, oh no, I'm going to have to work on Sahagún, because the literature on Sahagún is so vast and so complex, and I had always skirted around the Florentine and the Primeros Memoriales, and I thought this is an opportunity. But those two works, the Florentine especially, is our window into the Aztec world. And we know so much about the Aztecs because of the Florentine. And certainly it's mediated through, all of these European sources and European ways of thinking and framing and stuff. But it allows us to understand the Aztecs. And if you're interested in understanding the Aztecs, you really need to understand the Florentine. So I don't embrace it in my heart quite like Diana Magaloni did, because I haven't spent 9 months working on it. But it's always stood as the most important work for really Mesoamerican culture, because we understand Mesoamerican culture largely by our knowledge of Aztec culture.
Elizabeth, she said one sentence.
Sorry.
Can you do it in one sentence?
I just want to say, as an art historian, my sense is that Sahagún wanted to create an illuminated manuscript. He was between the illuminated manuscript and the print tradition. It's just a sheer joy for me to look at the images. I'll just leave it there. They're very rich.
I think that's a great way to stop it. Thank you for the question. Thank you to the speakers.
That was an incredible panel. Thank you to both speakers, Elizabeth and Jeanette. No? Fantastic. I'm going to give out a lot of thanks right now, beginning with the Getty Research Institute, the director, Thomas Gaetkins, Kim Richter, all of the people who have helped with this part of the conference, Sue Kang, Nathaniel Danes, Sally McKay, Lisa Cambier, Masa Hatam, such a wealth of extraordinary talent here at the Getty that make conferences here so special. And so I thank you. And I thank also Barbara Fuchs, the director of the Clark Library, and Jeanette Levere, and Kathy Sanchez, and Eric Bowman, who were so helpful yesterday in getting this conference off to a successful start. I want to thank the moderators, Daniela Blechmar and Kim Richter and Cecilia Klein, for not only moderating the sessions, but participating intellectually in each one and adding so much to each and every session. I thank you. What a wonderful embarrassment of riches we have here in Los Angeles to be able to ask such talented people. And the presenters, remarkable presentations. We are so fortunate that you could be with us and very grateful. Some of you have come from afar, from Mexico, from the East Coast. Thank you. And I'd like to thank Jeanette Peterson, my co-organizer and colleague, for working on this with me for the last 2 years. It's been a real pleasure to work with someone as charming and smart and nice as you. So thank you for being all of that. Just in reflecting on, the times of this manuscript, as an historian, I'm always trying to think about, what was happening when this manuscript was being written. And I think that Diana has written about this very, very compellingly. It's an extraordinary, complex, and unique manuscript that was written in a very dramatic time in history. I think the manuscript exemplifies the convergence of two cultural worlds and the collaboration of really intelligent people from those worlds in a time of transformation. A collaboration that involved dozens of people from different communities around the Great Lake in the Great Basin of Mexico, Lake Texcoco. In this first and second generations after the conquest, if Book 12 on the Conquest was written first around 1555, as we are told by Sahagún, that would put us about 34 years after the conquest. And many of the people, he tells us, were alive and remember that time and are speaking from their own memories. I mean, let's try to think of a contemporary comparison. Do you remember that great documentary series, World at War, in the 1970s? That was about 33, 34 years after World War II, when the BBC, interviewed these generals from Russia and Germany and France and England and the United States, as well as fighter pilots and foot soldiers, and who spoke vividly about their memories of this time. And likewise, we could think that these artists and writers and contributors, if they didn't remember times as vividly, certainly had a real connection with the past before the Europeans had ever arrived, when Moctezuma was still the Tlatoani of the great city of Mexico, Tenochtitlan. So the Florentine Codex represents a real connection to that past, and what a dramatic history we have here in the 16th century, with the passage of the new laws in 1542, which attempted to restrain the encomenderos the conquistadores and their descendants from profiting too much at the hands of native peoples. The 1548 epidemic, which decimated the population of central Mexico, and which almost killed Sahagún himself. He himself contracted smallpox in that epidemic, and it nearly killed him, he tells us. The death of Las Casas in 1566, after he had stirred up so much controversy about how the whole thing was going and how it had been achieved. And of course, the 1576 epidemics, which lasted a good 3 years in central Mexico, and were so severe that Sahagún wondered in this manuscript whether the Native Americans would become extinct one day. He said he thought it was quite possible. It was that serious, it was that grave. It's the type of thing that we can't imagine, right? We can't imagine how Sahagún, working with this extraordinary team, is seeing them die off. And at the same time, is trying to find time to go out and help other native peoples who are succumbing to the disease, and wavering between thinking this is God's curse on humankind, punishment for their sins of idolatry, conjuring up the curse of Jeremiah, and yet thinking that we should do more for these people, we should build more hospitals, we should try to help them more than we're doing. So Sahagún himself, living in this time, and obviously very sympathetic to Nahua culture and history. Why else would he take on such a massive project? He obviously, despite the overtures and of course the serious mission of extirpating idolatries, he clearly sympathized and loved these people, and you can see it, based on his lifelong dedication of work to this project, a project that came under fire even among his own Franciscans, who doubted the wisdom of doing what he was doing, questioning whether it was a good thing to keep all of these, all of this knowledge of the past and the gods alive by recording it. And so he had the project taken away from him. People were objecting to it, and he persevered. And in the end, it's a decree by King Philip II in 1577 to send everything that's being written about Indians or about the conquest or about all of those subjects, send them all to me in Madrid. Stop what you're writing and send it all. It was a sort of an attempt to try to put an end to, or to put a temporary stop at least to this discourse of history that was so controversial in this period. And so the Florentine Codex is whisked away from him. And he's nervous because he realizes that if this is taken away and some people disagree with it and destroy it, so he creates a second copy, and by some miracle, that second copy has survived, and it's what we have. It's what we have today. He then became rector of the Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco school, one of the first colleges in the Americas. Clearly the first college dedicated to the training and education of Native peoples, a long time before Harvard and Dartmouth and places like that. And he struggled financially in this period and was complaining about the lack of resources with which to work, with which to carry on this incredibly important project, a college, in which so many amazing European and indigenous minds, where they came together to work. I mean, some of the great grammarians and Franciscans who mastered Nahua also worked at the college, Fray Alonso de Molina, and so forth and so on, right? And so these were dramatic times, scholars, artists, writers working under pressure, deadlines, with all sorts of political obstacles, not to mention the threat of death. The colors running out. Literally, they were losing their tonali, people dying, no? And the result is this masterpiece, this bicultural, bivisual, bilingual masterpiece that essentially collects dust until after World War II. It's whisked away, it's sent off to the Medici as a gift. It ends up in the Lorenzian Library. It turns up in a catalog in the late 1790s, but nobody really works with it until after World War II. And in a sense, we're beginning to understand how complex this manuscript is, to the point that we are considering now not only one text, but three texts, as the title of this conference suggests. There is, of course, the Spanish translation, which ranged from verbatim translation, in some cases it's very good and very close, to a summary, to completely ignoring. There is no translation. So there's, within the 12 books itself, a great deal of variation there. The Spanish was the first to be used, of course. It was published in 1821 by the great Mexican historian Bustamante, and it became the basis of what we know as the Historia General until World War II or so. And then, of course, the Nahuatl, which was really Sahagún's primary interest, I think. I mean, he wanted to create a demonstrative vocabulary, a sort of Calepino that could serve as the basis that Virgil and Cicero's works served in Latin. And it's not really until Maria Angel Garibay and Anderson and Dibble in the 70s and 80s, and in the case of Book 12, James Lockhart, it's not really until the 70s and 80s and 90s that we get very good translations of the Nahuatl into Spanish and English, right? And then the images. The last to be created, we know they were created at the very end there before it was sent to Spain, and the last to be studied, really. It's only really in the 1980s, it seems to me, that art historians and others begin to pay real attention to the images. They had been dismissed as almost sort of Europeanized and not really worthy of serious study until then. And Eloise raised a very interesting point yesterday in her paper about how it must have been the indigenous artists who insisted on the images in this work because it was such an important part of their tradition. Very interesting proposal. I think Sahagún must have supported it as well. He didn't seem to oppose it in the sense that, you know, he was the one who was in charge of that Spanish language column, and that's where most of the images ended up in lieu of a translation. Thank goodness that, that the indigenous artists and Sahagún decided that the images were so important. This is probably the first conference dedicated to studying the images of the Florentine Codex. I can't think of another. It's certainly the first to encourage an integrated study of the texts. And so in that sense, we have come a long way. We have come a long way. We are not referring to the Florentine Codex as Sahagún's Florentine Codex, or Sahagún said this, or Sahagún said that. Rather, we understand, and we are not referring to the people who worked with him as his aides or his informants. You know, we are now speaking of co-authors, a team, a project, a very collaborative project, and we are placing more emphasis on the active participation, the agency of the native writers and artists in this production. Our findings leave us thinking, however, that we know less than we thought we knew, and that we want to learn more. I personally did not know 90%, más o menos, 95, okay, 95, of what was presented in this conference. Even Elizabeth Boone said she learned so much. The range of topics is as rich as the text itself. I mean, we talked about the sacred, water, conquest, snow, speech, sexuality, material objects, etc. There is so much promise, it seems to me, for further research. Although it's true that much has been written on the Florentine Codex, at the same time, surprisingly little has been written considering the incredible richness of the source compared to what has been written on some great manuscripts from Europe, for example. You know, really, there's a handful of anthologies on this work. One comes out about every 10 years or so. The ones that do exist are excellent. There's I don't know how many articles in Estudios de Cultura Nahua involving the Florentine Codex. I would venture thousands. No, Miguel León Portilla seems to write one every single volume. It's amazing, the output in that journal. There are works that use the Florentine for specific subjects, but rarely attempt to cover the entire work. One of the only books I know that attempts to cover the entire work by a single author is Diana Magaloni-Kirpel's book that you can find here in the GRI bookstore. It's a wonderful, handsome volume that's very affordable. I really highly recommend it. Go out and get it. You know, we're now at the point where we have the resources, the translations especially, and the interdisciplinary skills. Now we have scholars coming at this from different disciplines, and I think that's a really good thing. That's where innovations occur, at the boundaries of disciplines, right? We have scholars who have an extraordinary knowledge of other manuscripts, other Mesoamerican manuscripts, other European manuscripts. We have these scholars among us today. We heard from them today and yesterday. And it's this type of, I think it's this type of cross-examination that is really necessary to understand the context of the Florentine, rather than studying the Florentine itself in isolation, obviously. There is the desire to continue to study this manuscript. There's something about this manuscript. We have fallen in love with it, in a way. I have. So I want to continue to study it. I want to continue to meet, to study it, to contribute to publications on it, because it's so fascinating and rich and beautiful. But it's more than that. It's an important manuscript. You were saying this earlier, Diana. It's really an important manuscript from Mexico and for the Americas. It's a rare first manuscript to represent indigenous people that involves indigenous people. If it's an encyclopedia done in Mexico, well, when was the next encyclopedia done in Mexico? I don't know. Does anybody here, would it be the 19th, 20th centuries when an encyclopedia of Mexico would be done again? It's extremely rare in the sense that Mesoamerica was this unique place in the Americas where they had this incredible writing system. And because of that pre-conquest writing system, they were also able to receive and understand very quickly and very confidently the new alphabetic writing system that was introduced by the Europeans. So it's no coincidence that these peoples then wrote, millions of documents in their own languages using the Roman alphabet because they understood the concept of writing. But that didn't mean that they gave up the older form of writing. In fact, there's a long period in which the two traditions continue, and this manuscript exemplifies that, sort of parallel existence of two writing traditions. This manuscript is multicultural and multi-ethnic, and so it resonates with our own experiences in our own world, especially here in Los Angeles, right, where we have a vibrant Mexican descent population where culturally, historically, demographically, we are in many ways, a part of Mexico, right? There are many people with indigenous blood who live in Southern California and in Los Angeles. Los Angeles happens to be the city with the largest Native American population in the United States. And that's not counting the Mexican indigenous population that lives here. The Zapotecs, the Mixtecs, the Nahuas, the Maya, and the many other groups who live here and are a part of our vibrant, multicultural, multi-ethnic society. And I suppose that's why we're all here today, because it all makes perfect sense that we should be here and we should be doing things like this in Los Angeles. And so I thank you all for being here, and once again, I thank the GRI for hosting this wonderful conference, and thank you.